The carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Duke Alaric Voss gripped the door handle with a force that made his knuckles go white. He could not see the road ahead, but he could feel every jolt of it, every sudden dip, as if the world itself was testing how much a blind man could endure before he broke. 3 years had passed since the accident took his sight, and still his body flinched at every unexpected sound, every shift in the air. "We are almost at the gates, Your Grace," said Godfrey, his steward seated across from him. Godfrey's voice always carried a strange mixture of respect and pity, the kind that made Alaric's jaw tighten. "I know the road, Godfrey. I have traveled it 100 times." "Of course, Your Grace." Alaric said nothing more. He did not need to remind Godfrey, or anyone else, that he still knew his own estate better than most sighted men knew theirs. He had memorized the turns of every hallway, the creak of every floorboard, the exact number of steps between his study and the dining hall. What he could not memorize, what no man could prepare for, was the silence that had grown around him since the accident. Silence where laughter used to be. Silence where invitations used to arrive. Silence where a wife should have been. For 3 years, mothers of noble daughters had smiled politely at social gatherings and quietly steered their children away from him. At first, they offered excuses. Their daughters were too young, too delicate, too committed to other prospects. But excuses eventually gave way to whispers, and whispers to open avoidance. A blind duke was no longer seen as a man who had survived misfortune. He was seen as a burden waiting to be inherited. The carriage came to a stop, and Alaric heard the familiar creak of the estate's iron gates swinging open. Home. If it could still be called that. A house was not a home when it had become a place people spoke of in hushed, sorrowful tones, as though visiting a tomb rather than a residence. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and old paper, comforting in its familiarity. Alaric moved without hesitation, his hand skimming lightly along the wall as he walked, counting doorways out of habit rather than necessity. He had long since stopped needing a guiding hand indoors. It was only outside, in the unpredictable world of carriages and crowds, that his blindness truly betrayed him. "There is a matter I must discuss with you, Your Grace," Godfrey said, following close behind. "The quarterly accounts, they do not balance as they should." Alaric stopped walking. "Explain." "The numbers Master Corwin submitted. They do not match the harvest reports from the eastern fields. I fear there may be an error or worse." Alaric exhaled slowly. Since his accident, this was the 4th time discrepancies had appeared in his ledgers. He could not read the numbers himself, and he had grown weary of relying on second-hand accounts that always seemed to shift depending on who delivered them. It was a vulnerability he despised more than his blindness itself. A duke who could not verify his own finances was a duke ripe for exploitation, and he knew it. "I need someone who can go through every line of those books," Alaric said. "Someone I can trust to read them exactly as they are, without softening the truth or hiding it from me." "I have already sent word to town, Your Grace. There is a bookkeeper, recently arrived, highly recommended by the Merchants' Guild. A woman, if that does not trouble you." Alaric almost laughed. "Trouble me? Godfrey, at this point I would welcome a goat with an eye for numbers if it meant an honest account." "Her name is Elena Marchetti. She arrives tomorrow morning." That night Alaric sat alone in his study, his fingers tracing the familiar grooves of his father's old desk. He thought of the man he used to be before the accident, a man who could ride at dawn, read maps by candlelight, and charm an entire ballroom without effort. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he remembered rather than someone he was. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he would spend the rest of his life as a rumor whispered in drawing rooms, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters. The thought settled over him like a familiar weight, heavy but no longer surprising. Morning arrived with the sound of hooves on the gravel drive. Alaric stood at the top of the entrance steps, listening carefully. He could hear the carriage slow, the door open, and then footsteps, quick and purposeful, unlike the timid, uncertain steps of servants who often approached him with unnecessary caution. "Your Grace," Godfrey announced, "Miss Elena Marchetti has arrived." "Good morning, Your Grace," a clear, steady voice said. There was no hesitation in it, no forced sympathy, no careful softness reserved for the fragile. It was simply a voice speaking to another person. "Miss Marchetti," Alaric replied, "I trust Godfrey has explained the nature of the work." "He has. Your finances are in disorder, and you wish to know exactly how disordered, without anyone deciding for you what parts of the truth you can handle." Alaric's brows lifted slightly. It had been a long time since anyone spoke to him so plainly. "That is a fair summary." "Then let us begin. I would like access to the ledgers from the last 2 years, the harvest records, and any correspondence related to the eastern fields." "You may have whatever you require." He paused, curious despite himself. "Most people, upon meeting me, feel the need to comment on my condition within the first few sentences. You have not." "Should I have?" "No," Alaric said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something close to amusement touched his voice. "You should not." Alina was led to the study that would serve as her workspace for the coming weeks, a room lined with shelves of ledgers, some untouched for years. She wasted no time in beginning her review, opening the oldest books first, tracing figures with her finger, comparing totals against harvest reports with the focus of someone who found genuine satisfaction in solving problems others found tedious. She had grown up in her father's counting house, surrounded by merchants who cared more about numbers than titles. Nobility had never impressed her, not because she resented it, but because she had simply never been taught to be impressed by it. To her, a duke was only a man with more responsibility and apparently more opportunities for those around him to take advantage of his trust. By midday, she had already found 3 inconsistencies. By evening, she requested a meeting with the duke. "Your Grace, I must be direct," she said, standing in his study as he sat near the window, his face turned toward the sound of her voice. "Someone has been altering the harvest totals from the eastern fields for at least 18 months. The discrepancies are small enough to avoid immediate notice, but they add up to a significant sum." Godfrey suspected as much. "Godfrey suspected an error. I am telling you it is not an error. It is deliberate." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Do you have a name?" "Not yet. I need more time with the correspondence, and I would like to speak with the tenants directly, if you permit it." "You wish to visit the eastern fields yourself?" "Numbers on a page can be shaped into any story someone wants them to tell. The tenants who work that land cannot be shaped so easily. If you want the truth, Your Grace, sometimes you must leave the ledgers and go where the truth actually lives." Alaric considered her words carefully. No one had spoken to him with such directness in years. Servants tiptoed around him, nobles offered hollow sympathy, and even Godfrey, loyal as he was, often softened bad news before delivering it. Alina Marchetti did none of that. She simply told him what she saw without embellishment or apology. "Permission granted," he said finally. "Take whoever you need for the journey." "I do not need an escort, Your Grace. I need honesty from the people I speak to, and a crowded carriage of guards rarely encourages that." "You will take a driver at minimum." "I insist." Alina tilted her head slightly as though weighing whether to argue, then decided against it. "Very well, a driver." As she turned to leave, Alaric spoke again, almost without meaning to. "Miss Marchetti." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why did the Merchants' Guild recommend you so highly? Surely there are many capable bookkeepers in town." There was a brief pause before she answered. "Because I do not tell people what they want to hear. I tell them what is true, even when it is inconvenient. Most people find that unpleasant. Apparently, your steward found it useful." "And do you find it unpleasant? Working for a blind duke, whom half the county considers a burden not worth marrying?" The question hung in the air, sharper than he intended, laced with old bitterness he rarely allowed himself to voice aloud. He expected silence or worse, pity. "I find it interesting," Alina said instead, her tone unreadable. "A man everyone assumes is helpless, yet manages his estate, questions his own ledgers, and grants permission to a stranger to investigate his affairs without hovering over her shoulder the entire time. That is not the portrait of a burden, Your Grace. That is the portrait of a man people have simply stopped looking at closely. She left before he could respond, her footsteps fading down the corridor, steady and unhurried. Alaric sat in the quiet that followed, turning her words over in his mind. For 3 years, he had grown used to being spoken about rather than spoken to, discussed in careful, pitying tones by people who assumed his blindness had dulled his understanding of the world. Elena Marchetti had done neither. She had simply looked past what everyone else saw first, and for reasons he could not entirely explain, that single difference unsettled him more than any sympathy ever had. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the old estate, and somewhere in the eastern fields, a secret waited to be uncovered, one that would test not only the Duke's finances, but the fragile trust beginning to form between two people who, until that morning, had been complete strangers. The road to the eastern fields wound through hills still damp from the previous night's rain, and Elena sat beside the driver, a quiet young man named Peter, watching the countryside roll past without truly watching it at all. Her mind was still turning over numbers, dates, and names, trying to fit together a puzzle that grew more troubling the longer she studied it. She had spent the previous evening comparing every entry in the ledgers against the harvest correspondence, cross-referencing dates with the seasons in which certain crops would realistically have been gathered. What she found unsettled her. The numbers were not simply wrong. They were wrong in a pattern, adjusted just enough each season to avoid drawing attention, yet consistent enough to suggest a single hand behind them. "You are quiet this morning, Miss Marchetti," Peter said, glancing sideways at her. "I am thinking," she replied. "Tell me, Peter, how long have you worked for the Duke?" "Since before his accident. My father worked these lands before me." "And the eastern fields, specifically. Who oversees the harvest there?" Peter hesitated, his hands tightening slightly on the reins. "Master Corwin manages most of the estate's dealings with the tenants out that way. He has done so for many years, long before Duke Alaric inherited the title." Elena filed that name away carefully. Corwin, the same name attached to the discrepancies Godfrey had first flagged. They arrived at a small cluster of cottages nestled at the edge of the eastern fields, where golden stalks of wheat stretched toward the horizon under a sky still heavy with clouds. An older woman stood near a well, drawing water, and looked up with mild curiosity as the carriage approached. "Good day," Elena said, stepping down. "I am here on behalf of Duke Voss. I would like to ask a few questions about the harvest if you have time to spare." The woman's expression shifted slightly, cautious but not unfriendly. "You are not the usual sort sent from the estate." "No," Elena said simply, "I am not." "I am Agnes," the woman said. "My husband and I have worked this land for 11 years. What is it you wish to know?" "How much wheat did your family harvest last season, as best you can recall?" Agnes considered the question, counting silently on her fingers. "Somewhere near 40 sacks, perhaps a little more. It was a good season, better than most." Elena nodded, already comparing the number in her mind against what the official records claimed. The ledgers listed only 32 sacks from Agnes's plot, a discrepancy of 8, small enough to seem like a rounding error unless one considered how many similar plots existed across the eastern fields, each shaved down by a few sacks here and there. "Do you know who records these numbers when the harvest is collected?" "Master Corwin comes through personally each season. He writes everything down himself. Very particular about it, he is. Doesn't like anyone else touching his ledger." "Has that always been the practice?" Agnes frowned slightly, thinking. "No, actually. Before the Duke's accident, old Master Halloway used to oversee the harvest records, alongside 2 of the tenant elders who would confirm the totals together. After the accident, when everything changed at the estate, Master Corwin took over the duty entirely on his own. Said it was more efficient that way, one less person to coordinate with during a difficult time." Elena felt the pieces sliding into place with quiet, unwelcome clarity. A man who once shared the harvest recording duties with witnesses had, immediately following the Duke's loss of sight, taken sole control of those very records. with no one left to confirm or contest his numbers. She spent the remainder of the day speaking with several more tenant families, each recounting harvest totals that consistently exceeded what appeared in the estate's official ledgers. The pattern held steady across every plot she visited, small discrepancies accumulating into a substantial sum over the 18 months since Corwin had assumed sole control. By the time she returned to the estate, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. She found Alaric in his study, seated near the fireplace, listening to the crackle of burning wood with the same quiet stillness she had noticed during their first meeting. "You return later than expected," he said, recognizing her footsteps before she spoke. "I found more than I expected, Your Grace." He gestured toward the chair across from him, and she sat, pulling a small notebook from her satchel where she had recorded every conversation from the day. "Master Corwin," she began, "has sole authority over recording the harvest totals from the eastern fields, a responsibility he assumed shortly after your accident. Previously, the duty was shared among multiple people, which naturally prevented any single individual from manipulating the numbers without others noticing. Now there is no such safeguard." Alaric's expression darkened, though he remained still, his hands folded calmly in his lap despite the tension Alina could sense building beneath his composed exterior. "Corwin has served this family for over 20 years. My father trusted him completely. I understand this is difficult to hear, Your Grace, but every tenant I spoke with today recalled harvest totals higher than what appears in your official records. The differences are consistent, deliberate, and they began precisely when Corwin took sole control of the recording process." "You believe he is stealing from me?" "I believe the evidence strongly suggests it, yes, though I would caution against confronting him without further proof. A man clever enough to manipulate records so carefully for 18 months will not confess simply because we ask him to." Alaric rose from his chair and walked toward the window, though he could see nothing beyond it. Old habits, Alina realized, did not fade simply because the eyes no longer served their purpose. He stood there for a long moment, silent, before speaking again. "When my father was alive, Corwin was among the most respected men on this estate. He taught me to ride, taught me the boundaries of every field before I could read a map myself. After my accident, when so many others began treating me as though I had already died and left only a ghost behind to manage the title, Corwin remained. He never once suggested I step aside, never spoke of me the way the others did." "Perhaps," Alina said carefully, "he simply understood that appearing loyal would protect the very deception he had already begun." Alaric's jaw tightened, but he did not argue against her reasoning because he could not. The timing was too precise, the pattern too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence or misplaced trust. "What would you suggest, Miss Marchetti?" "Continue the investigation quietly. Gather written statements from the tenants, compare seasonal records further back, and determine exactly how much has been taken before confronting him. If we act too soon, he may destroy evidence or find a way to shift blame elsewhere." "You speak as though you have done this before." "My father's counting house dealt with dishonest merchants more often than he would have liked. I learned early that confronting a thief before you have proof only teaches him to hide his tracks more carefully next time." Alaric turned back toward her, and though his eyes could not meet hers directly, there was something in the angle of his head, the attentiveness in his posture, that suggested he was listening more closely than most sighted men ever bothered to. "You could have told me nothing," he said quietly. "You could have padded the numbers, softened the truth, or simply declared everything in order and collected your payment without ever venturing to the eastern fields at all. Many would have. It would have been far easier. That would have made me useless to you, Your Grace, and dishonest besides. I was hired to find the truth, not to make you comfortable. Most people around me seem far more concerned with my comfort than with the truth." "Then perhaps," Alina said, gathering her notebook and rising from her chair, "most people around you have mistaken kindness for honesty. They are rarely the same thing." She left him standing near the window, the fire casting flickering light across a face that, for the first time in longer than he could recall, wore an expression closer to determination than resignation. Somewhere within the walls of his own estate, a betrayal had taken root, cultivated by a man he had trusted since childhood, made possible only because everyone assumed a blind Duke would never notice, and would never think to look closely enough to catch it. That night, sleep did not come easily to either of them. Alina lay awake in the small guest chamber assigned to her, reviewing the day's findings again and again, searching for any detail that might strengthen the case before they moved forward. Alaric remained in his study long after the household had gone quiet, listening to the settling creaks of the old house, thinking of a trust built over 20 years now cracking beneath the weight of careful, deliberate theft. Neither of them yet realized how deeply this discovery would change the course of everything that followed, nor how the woman hired simply to balance his ledgers was about to become the one person standing firmly between the Duke and those who had underestimated him for far too long. 3 weeks passed before Alina felt confident enough to bring her full findings before the Duke. In that time, she had traveled to nearly every plot within the eastern fields, gathering written statements from tenant families, comparing harvest totals across 5 full seasons, and quietly requesting records from the grain merchants in town who had purchased the estate's surplus each year. The picture that emerged was far larger and far more damning than either of them had first suspected. She arrived at the study one gray morning carrying a leather folder thick with papers, her expression composed but serious. Alaric sat at his desk, his fingers resting on a small wooden abacus Godfrey had brought him years ago, a tool he rarely used but kept nearby out of habit, a small reminder of a mind that still worked in numbers even without sight to confirm them. "You have finished," he said, recognizing the particular rhythm of her footsteps, quicker than usual, carrying the weight of purpose. "I have, Your Grace, and I believe you should sit with me while I explain everything in full, because the amount involved is far greater than either of us initially expected." Alaric gestured toward the chair across from him, and Alina sat, opening her folder with practiced efficiency. "Master Corwin has been altering harvest records for at least 5 years, not 18 months as we first believed. The discrepancies began small, only a handful of sacks here and there across a few plots, easy to dismiss as error. But as the years progressed, particularly after your accident removed any possibility of you personally reviewing the fields, the amounts grew steadily larger." "How much, Miss Marchetti?" Alina hesitated only a moment before answering plainly, exactly as he had asked of her from their very first conversation. "By my calculations, cross-referenced against grain merchant sales in town, Corwin has diverted and sold approximately 4,000 crowns worth of your harvest over the past 5 years, recording it as spoiled crop, storage loss, or simply omitting it from the official totals entirely." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alina wondered if she had misjudged how directly to deliver such news. But when Alaric finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled in the way of a man who had already suspected the worst and was simply absorbing its confirmation. 4,000 crowns, he repeated quietly. Enough to have repaired the northern bridge, replaced the roof over the tenant cottages, and still left surplus for a difficult winter. "Yes, Your Grace." "And you are certain, absolutely certain before I act on this?" "I have signed statements from 11 tenant families, records from 3 separate grain merchants confirming sales that never appeared in your official ledgers, and a pattern of manipulation that begins precisely when Corwin assumed sole control of the harvest recording. I would not bring this before you if I harbored any doubt, Your Grace. I understand what accusing a man of Corwin's standing will mean, both for him and for this household." Alaric rose from his desk, walking the familiar path toward the window, though he no longer did so to look outside, but simply because movement helped him think, a habit carried over from a life when his eyes had once guided such pacing. "When my father was dying," he said, his voice distant, recalling a memory long buried, "he told me that a duke's greatest weakness was not the loss of strength or health, but the loss of vigilance. He said a man could survive nearly any misfortune, so long as he never stopped watching those closest to him. I thought foolishly that losing my sight meant only that I could no longer watch the horizon, or read a map, or recognize a face across a room. I did not consider that it also meant I could no longer watch the men I trusted most, and that someone might use that blindness against me so precisely. Your Grace, the failure was not yours. Corwin exploited a trust that any reasonable man would have extended to someone who served his family for 20 years. The deception belongs entirely to him. Perhaps, Alaric said, though his tone suggested he was not yet fully convinced. But the vulnerability was mine, and I nearly allowed it to continue indefinitely, simply because I assumed loyalty could not be manufactured so convincingly. Loyalty can be manufactured by anyone patient enough to wait for the right circumstances, Alina said. It does not mean you were foolish to trust him initially. It means Corwin was patient, calculating, and willing to wait years for an opportunity as significant as your accident before acting on his greed fully. That is not a flaw in your character, Your Grace. That is simply the nature of deception practiced by someone skilled enough to sustain it this long. Alaric turned back toward her, and though he could not see the steadiness in her gaze, he could hear it clearly in her voice, unwavering, certain, entirely without the pity he had grown so accustomed to receiving from everyone else in his life. What do you suggest, Miss Marchetti? You have proven remarkably capable of anticipating the correct course of action thus far. Confronting him privately would allow him the opportunity to flee before facing consequences, or worse, to threaten the tenants who provided statements against him, silencing witnesses before any formal accusation could proceed. I would suggest instead that we gather the evidence quietly, involve the local magistrate discreetly, and arrange for Corwin's confrontation to occur in a setting where he has no opportunity to escape or intimidate those who spoke against him. You wish to involve the magistrate before I have even confronted the man myself. I wish to protect the tenants who trusted me with their honest accounts, Your Grace, and to ensure Corwin faces the full consequences of what he has done, rather than simply being quietly dismissed and allowed to disappear with whatever remains of the stolen sum. If this matter is handled only privately, within these walls, there is a risk that public perception will shift the story in unpredictable directions, particularly given how certain individuals in the county already speak of you. Alaric understood her meaning immediately. There would be those who, upon hearing that the Duke had been deceived for 5 years without noticing, would use it as further proof of his supposed incapacity, further justification for the whispers that had followed him since his accident. A quiet, private resolution risked feeding exactly the narrative he had spent 3 years trying to disprove through sheer persistence and careful management of his estate. You believe a public resolution would serve me better. I believe a public resolution, handled correctly, would demonstrate precisely the opposite of what people currently assume about you. It would show a duke capable of uncovering a sophisticated deception, holding a trusted servant accountable through proper legal channels, and protecting his tenants from further exploitation. That is not the portrait of a helpless man, Your Grace. That is the portrait of a capable one. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing, weighing her words carefully against the instinct toward privacy that had governed so much of his life since the accident, an instinct born from years of avoiding public scrutiny, avoiding the pitying glances and careful whispers that followed him whenever he ventured beyond his own estate. Very well, he said finally. Arrange a meeting with the magistrate, quietly, as you suggested, but thoroughly. I want every piece of evidence prepared beyond question before we proceed. I will begin immediately, Your Grace. As she gathered her papers to leave, Alaric spoke once more, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity he had not permitted himself in quite some time. Miss Marchetti, may I ask you something unrelated to the matter at hand? Of course. Why does none of this frighten you? Investigating a man twice your age, accusing him of theft, arranging confrontations with magistrates. Most people in your position would have simply reported the discrepancies and considered their obligation fulfilled, leaving the rest to men more comfortable with confrontation. Alina considered the question seriously before answering. My father taught me that honesty without courage accomplishes very little, Your Grace. It is easy to discover the truth. It is far more difficult to act on it once discovered, particularly when doing so risks upsetting powerful people who might prefer the truth remain buried. I did not travel here simply to point at numbers and walk away. I came to finish what I started, regardless of whose comfort it disturbs along the way. And my comfort, does it concern you at all? Your comfort concerns me considerably less than your well-being, Your Grace. Comfort and well-being are rarely the same thing, particularly in situations such as this one. She left the study before he could respond, and Alaric sat alone once more, turning her words over carefully in his mind. In 3 years since his accident, he had encountered countless people eager to comfort him, to soften every difficult truth, to speak around uncomfortable realities rather than through them directly. Alina Marchetti offered none of that careful softness, and strangely, he found himself grateful for its absence rather than troubled by it. Over the following days, preparations proceeded quietly. Alina traveled once more to the eastern fields, gathering additional statements and ensuring every tenant understood their testimony would be protected once formal proceedings began. Godfrey, initially skeptical of involving the magistrates so directly, gradually came to support the approach, once he reviewed the full extent of evidence Alina had compiled. Evidence far more thorough than he had believed possible from a single bookkeeper working largely alone. The local magistrate, a measured man named Lord Whitmore, agreed to review the evidence privately before any formal accusation proceeded, a necessary step to ensure the case would withstand scrutiny once brought before Corwin himself. He spent 2 full days examining ledgers, tenant statements, and merchant records before finally summoning Alina and Alaric together to deliver his assessment. This is among the most thoroughly documented cases of estate theft I have reviewed in my tenure, Lord Whitmore said, seated across from them in his modest office in town. Miss Marchetti, your work here is exceptional. Few investigators, professional or otherwise, could have assembled evidence this comprehensive in so short a time. Thank you, my lord. Duke Voss, I must ask directly. Are you prepared for what confronting Corwin publicly will mean? Word will spread quickly through the county once formal proceedings begin. There will be those who question how such deception continued undetected for so long under your management. Alaric's expression remained calm, though Alina, seated beside him, noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful control he exercised over his own composure. I am prepared, my lord. I would rather face uncomfortable questions about my vigilance than continue allowing a thief to profit from my tenants' honest labor simply to avoid those questions. Lord Whitmore nodded, apparently satisfied by the response. Very well, I will arrange for Corwin's formal summons within the week. Given the strength of this evidence, I anticipate little difficulty securing a conviction, assuming he does not attempt to flee beforehand. We have taken precautions against that possibility, my lord, Alina said. The tenants have agreed to notify us immediately should Corwin make any unusual arrangements or attempt to leave the county unexpectedly. As they departed the magistrate's office and climbed back into the waiting carriage, Alaric remained quiet for much of the journey home, his mind clearly occupied with thoughts he had not yet voiced aloud. Alina, sensing his need for silence, did not press him to speak, content simply to sit beside him as the carriage rolled steadily through the familiar countryside. It was only as they approached the estate gates that he finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant in a way she had not yet heard from him. Miss Marchetti, whatever happens in the coming weeks, whatever the county chooses to say about how this deception occurred, I want you to know that your work here has already accomplished something I did not believe possible 3 years ago. And what is that, Your Grace? It has reminded me that being unable to see does not mean being unable to know the truth, provided one surrounds oneself with people willing to seek it honestly on one's behalf. For 3 years, I convinced myself that my blindness had made me permanently dependent on others' judgment, unable to verify anything for myself. You have proven that assumption false, and I find I am considerably more grateful for that than I know how to properly express. Alina did not respond immediately, considering her words carefully before speaking. You do not need to see the truth yourself, Your Grace, to recognize it clearly once it is presented to you. That recognition, that willingness to act decisively once the truth is known, that has always belonged entirely to you. I simply gathered the pieces. You are the one who chose to act on them, despite every reason to avoid the discomfort that choice would bring. The carriage came to a stop before the estate's entrance, and as Godfrey moved to open the door, Alaric remained still a moment longer, absorbing her words with the same careful attention he had shown throughout their weeks working together. Whatever awaited them in the confrontation ahead, whatever consequences the coming days would bring, both of them understood that something significant had already shifted between them, something built not on pity or obligation, but on a mutual respect neither had expected to find in the other. The morning of the confrontation arrived beneath a pale, colorless sky, the kind that promised rain without delivering it. Lord Whitmore had arranged for Corwin to be summoned to the estate under the guise of a routine quarterly review, a pretense designed to prevent any early warning that might allow him to destroy remaining evidence or flee before facing formal accusation. Alina stood near the study window, watching through its glass panes as Corwin's modest carriage approached along the gravel drive, though Alaric, seated behind his desk, relied entirely on the sound of hooves and wheels to mark the man's arrival. "He is here," Alina said quietly. "Then let us begin," Alaric replied, his voice carrying a steadiness that betrayed none of the tension she suspected he felt beneath his composed exterior. Master Corwin entered the study moments later, his greeting warm and familiar, entirely unaware of what awaited him. "Your Grace, I trust you are well. Godfrey mentioned you wished to review the Eastern Field totals personally this quarter." "Sit, Corwin," Alaric said, gesturing toward the chair positioned before his desk. A chair Alina had specifically arranged to face both the Duke and, unseen by Corwin until he turned, Lord Whitmore, who sat quietly near the far wall alongside 2 witnesses from town. Corwin's easy smile faltered slightly as he noticed the additional presence in the room, though he recovered quickly, taking his seat with practiced composure. "Your Grace, I was not aware this would be a larger gathering. Miss Marchetti has spent the past several weeks reviewing the estate's finances in detail," Alaric said. "She has uncovered certain discrepancies regarding the Eastern Field harvests, discrepancies that trace directly back to your sole management of those records over the past 5 years. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Alina to watch Corwin's expression shift through several careful calculations, weighing denial against explanation, searching for whatever response might best serve him in this unexpected circumstance. "Your Grace, I do not know what Miss Marchetti believes she has found, but I assure you, any discrepancies are simply the natural result of unpredictable harvests, spoilage, and the ordinary challenges of managing land as extensive as yours. 11 tenant families recall harvest totals consistently higher than what appears in your official records, Master Corwin," Alina said, stepping forward and opening her leather folder. 3 separate grain merchants in town confirm sales that never appeared anywhere in the estate's ledgers. The pattern spans 5 full seasons, growing steadily larger each year, precisely coinciding with the period during which you assumed complete control over the recording process, a control you did not possess before the Duke's accident. Corwin's composure cracked slightly, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his features before he forced it back beneath a mask of wounded dignity. "You accuse me based on the recollections of tenants who cannot possibly remember exact figures from years past, and merchant records that could easily reflect sales from entirely different sources. The merchants have provided written statements confirming the specific origin of each transaction, Master Corwin, along with dates that align precisely with your recorded harvest collections. Alina replied, unmoved by his protest. I would be happy to review each document individually if you require clarification on any particular season. Lord Whitmore rose from his seat near the wall, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his measured tone. Master Corwin, I have personally reviewed the entirety of this evidence over the past several days. It is, in my professional assessment, among the most thoroughly documented cases of estate theft I have encountered. I would strongly advise against continuing to deny what has already been established beyond reasonable question. For a long moment, Corwin said nothing, his eyes moving between Alaric's calm, unreadable expression and Alina's steady gaze, searching perhaps for some flicker of doubt or hesitation he might exploit. He found none. "Your Grace," Corwin finally said, his voice losing much of its earlier confidence, "you must understand my own circumstances have grown difficult in recent years. My daughter's health, the expenses of her care, they exceeded what my wages here could reasonably provide. I never intended permanent harm. I intended only to borrow against future earnings, to repay it eventually once circumstances improved." 4,000 crowns is not a loan, Corwin, Alaric said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority Alina had not yet heard from him so clearly. "It is theft, sustained deliberately over 5 years, taken directly from tenant families who worked that land honestly, families who deserved fair compensation for their labor regardless of your personal circumstances. Your Grace, please, consider the years I have served this family, the loyalty I have shown since your father's time." "I have considered it extensively, Corwin, particularly in recent weeks, and I find that loyalty maintained only until the opportunity for betrayal presented itself is not loyalty at all. It is patience in service of deception." Lord Whitmore stepped forward, his tone formal now, official. "Master Corwin, given the evidence presented and your admission just now regarding the diverted funds, I have no choice but to proceed with formal charges. You will be required to appear before the county court within a fortnight to answer fully for these matters." The remainder of the confrontation proceeded with a kind of quiet, exhausted inevitability. Corwin, recognizing the futility of further denial, offered no additional resistance, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by resigned acceptance as Lord Whitmore's assistants escorted him from the estate to await the formal proceedings ahead. When the study finally emptied, leaving only Alaric and Alina within its familiar walls, a heavy silence settled between them, the particular exhaustion that follows any difficult confrontation successfully endured. "You did not flinch once," Alaric said eventually, breaking the quiet. "Throughout the entire exchange, your voice remained perfectly steady. I had weeks to prepare for that moment, Your Grace. Steadiness becomes easier when one has rehearsed the truth thoroughly beforehand." Even so, many would have hesitated, faced with a man twice their age, pleading circumstances designed specifically to invoke sympathy. "His circumstances may well be genuinely difficult, Your Grace. I do not doubt his daughter's illness is real, or that his expenses grew beyond what his wages could cover. But difficult circumstances do not justify theft from people who possessed far less than he did, tenant families who worked that land with their own hands and received nothing but reduced totals for their honest labor. Sympathy for Corwin's struggles cannot come at the expense of justice for those he harmed." Alaric considered her words carefully, recognizing in them the same unflinching clarity that had characterized every conversation between them since her arrival. "You possess a rather firm sense of justice, Miss Marchetti. My father instilled it in me early, Your Grace. He always said that mercy without accountability simply teaches dishonest men that consequences can be avoided through sufficiently sympathetic excuses. I do not believe in cruelty toward Corwin, but I do believe in ensuring the tenants he harmed receive proper restitution, and that others watching this outcome understand such deception will not go unpunished simply because the victim happened to be a duke, unable to personally verify every ledger himself." In the weeks that followed, As Corwin's formal trial proceeded through the county court, word of the case spread steadily through the surrounding villages and eventually into the drawing rooms of the local nobility. What began as quiet gossip about a steward's betrayal gradually transformed into something Alina had specifically hoped for from the outset. A narrative that painted the Duke not as a helpless victim deceived for years without notice, but as a capable landowner who had uncovered sophisticated theft through diligent investigation and decisive action once the truth became clear. Tenant families, previously accustomed to speaking of the Duke only in careful, sympathetic tones reserved for misfortune, began instead to speak of him with something closer to respect, recounting how he had listened seriously to their concerns, pursued justice thoroughly, and ensured proper restitution once Corwin's guilt was formally established through the county court's ruling. Godfrey, who had initially worried that public exposure of the theft might further damage the Duke's already fragile reputation, found himself pleasantly surprised by the shifting tide of local opinion. "Your Grace," he remarked one evening, several weeks after Corwin's conviction, "I have heard considerably less pitying talk regarding your circumstances in recent weeks, and considerably more genuine respect for how thoroughly this matter was handled." "That is largely due to Miss Marchetti's efforts, Godfrey, not my own." "Perhaps, Your Grace, though I would gently suggest that recognizing her value, trusting her judgment, and acting decisively once she presented her findings, that too reflects rather well on your own character. Many men in your position might have dismissed a young bookkeeper's concerns entirely, particularly one so willing to challenge a trusted servant's loyalty." Alaric did not respond immediately, turning Godfrey's observation over in his mind long after the older man had left the study. He thought of Alina's steady voice throughout the confrontation, her careful preparation, her refusal to soften uncomfortable truths regardless of whose comfort it disturbed. He thought, too, of how naturally he had come to rely on her judgment over these past weeks, not out of desperation born from his blindness, but out of genuine respect for a mind sharper and more thorough than nearly anyone else's he had encountered since his accident. What he did not yet fully recognize, though it had already begun taking root somewhere beneath his careful composure, was that his growing reliance on Alina Marchetti had started to feel less like professional necessity and more like something considerably harder to name, something that unsettled him precisely because he had assumed, after 3 years of isolation, that he had lost the capacity to feel it at all. Autumn had settled fully over the county by the time trouble arrived from an unexpected direction, carried not by a trusted servant's betrayal this time, but by a neighboring lord whose ambitions had long simmered beneath a veneer of polite cordiality. Lord Edmund Ashcombe, whose estate bordered the northern edge of Alaric's lands, had watched the unfolding scandal surrounding Corwin's conviction with considerable interest, recognizing in it an opportunity he had perhaps long awaited but never before found sufficient reason to pursue. The letter arrived on a crisp morning in early October, delivered by Ashcombe's personal messenger with a formality that immediately struck Godfrey as unusual. Alaric listened as Alina read its contents aloud, her voice carrying a note of growing disbelief as she progressed through the carefully worded legal language. "He claims the northern boundary between your estates was never properly documented," Alina said, "and that a survey conducted decades ago, one he alleges was inaccurate, granted your family nearly 300 acres that rightfully belong to his own lineage. He intends to bring formal claim before the county court within the month." 300 acres, Alaric repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. "That boundary has stood unchallenged since before my grandfather's time." He appears to be arguing precisely that its long-standing acceptance was itself the result of an error compounding over generations, one he now wishes formally corrected in his favor. Godfrey, standing near the doorway, shook his head with obvious frustration. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but this timing is no coincidence. Ashcombe has watched the scandal surrounding Corwin unfold for months. He believes you vulnerable, distracted, perhaps even doubting your own capacity to defend what is rightfully yours after discovering how thoroughly you were deceived by someone you trusted. Alina's expression sharpened with the same focused determination Alaric had witnessed throughout the Corwin investigation. "Your Grace, may I review the original survey documents and any historical records related to that boundary? If Ashcombe intends to challenge a claim this old, there must be substantial documentation somewhere within your estate archives supporting your family's rightful ownership. You believe you can find evidence to counter his claim." "I believe evidence exists, Your Grace. Whether it can be found in time, and whether it will prove sufficiently compelling before the county court, remains to be determined. But I do not believe Lord Ashcombe would risk formal legal proceedings without believing he possesses some genuine advantage, whether real or simply perceived. We must understand precisely what that advantage is before we can effectively counter it." Over the following days, Alina immersed herself in the estate's oldest archives, a dusty collection of records stretching back generations, documenting land grants, boundary surveys, and inheritance disputes long since settled and forgotten by all but the most meticulous historians. She worked long hours, often past midnight, cross-referencing old maps against more recent surveys, searching for any inconsistency that might explain the foundation of Ashcombe's claim. It was on the fourth night of her search that she finally uncovered something significant: a detailed survey commissioned by Alaric's grandfather nearly 60 years prior, complete with signatures from officials representing both estates, formally establishing the northern boundary precisely where it had remained ever since. More importantly, buried within a separate collection of correspondence, she found letters exchanged between the two families at the time, revealing that Ashcombe's own great-grandfather had personally reviewed and approved the survey's findings before signing the formal agreement. She brought the discovery to Alaric immediately, despite the late hour, finding him still awake in his study, as had become increasingly common during this period of renewed uncertainty. "Your Grace, I have found something I believe will prove decisive." She spread the documents carefully across his desk, describing each one in detail as she guided his fingers across the aged paper, allowing him to feel the formal seals and signatures even though he could not see them directly. "This survey, commissioned by your grandfather, was formally reviewed and signed by Ashcombe's own great-grandfather. He personally approved the very boundary his descendant now claims was established in error." Alaric's fingers traced the raised wax seal slowly, his expression shifting from cautious hope toward something closer to genuine relief. "This is conclusive." "It should be, Your Grace, provided the court accepts the document's authenticity. Given its age and the formal seals present, I do not believe that will pose significant difficulty. Lord Ashcombe has either forgotten this agreement exists within his own family's records, or he is gambling that you would be unable to locate sufficient evidence to counter his claim before the court date arrives." "He gambled on my blindness," Alaric said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. "He assumed I could not personally search these archives myself, and that whoever assisted me would either lack the thoroughness required or simply not think to search far enough back to find this agreement. A gamble he is very likely to lose, Your Grace, provided we present this evidence properly before the court." The following weeks passed in careful preparation, Alina working alongside a barrister retained specifically for the proceedings, ensuring every document was properly authenticated, every historical detail cross-referenced against additional records to withstand whatever challenges Ashcombe's own legal counsel might raise. Alaric, for his part, insisted on understanding every detail of the case personally, requiring Alina to read each document aloud repeatedly, until he could recite the relevant details from memory, determined not to appear before the court as a passive party relying entirely on others to defend what belonged to him. "You need not memorize every clause, Your Grace," Alina said one evening, finding him repeating survey coordinates under his breath as though rehearsing lines for a performance. "The barrister will present the formal arguments. Your presence alone, calm and composed, will speak sufficiently to the court." I have spent 3 years allowing others to speak for me in matters I once handled personally, Miss Marchetti. I do not intend to sit silently through proceedings determining the fate of land my family has held for generations, simply because I cannot read the documents myself. If I am to face Ashcombe in that courtroom, I will face him fully prepared, not merely present. Alina studied him for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her expression before she nodded and continued the review without further protest. The day of the court proceedings arrived beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. The county courthouse filled with more spectators than such matters typically attracted, drawn by the same curiosity that had followed the Corwin scandal months earlier. Lord Ashcombe sat across the chamber, his expression carrying the confident ease of a man who believed victory already assured, occasionally glancing toward Alaric with an expression bordering on pity that made Alina's jaw tighten with barely restrained frustration. The proceedings began with Ashcombe's barrister presenting the formal claim, arguing at length that the original survey had contained fundamental errors, citing minor inconsistencies in measurement techniques common to surveys of that era, techniques since replaced by more precise modern methods. It was, Alina recognized immediately, a carefully constructed argument designed to cast doubt on the survey's overall reliability without directly addressing its formal acceptance by both families at the time. When it came time for Alaric's counsel to respond, the barrister rose and, as prearranged, first invited the Duke himself to address the court briefly before proceeding with the formal legal argument, a request that visibly startled Ashcombe, who had clearly not anticipated the Duke speaking personally on his own behalf. Alaric rose from his seat, and though he could not see the courtroom before him, he stood with the same composed bearing that had once made him among the most respected young noblemen in the county, before his accident had led so many to underestimate what remained of that man beneath the blindness. "My lords," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I cannot see the documents presented before this court today, a fact my opponent's counsel has perhaps counted upon in bringing this claim forward at this particular time. But I have studied every detail of this matter thoroughly, not through sight, but through careful diligence, and I stand before you fully prepared to discuss the specifics of this boundary dispute in whatever depth this court requires." He proceeded, without hesitation, to recite the precise coordinates established by the original survey, the exact date of its formal signing, and most significantly, the specific language used within the correspondence exchanged between the two families at the time, correspondence that included Ashcombe's own great-grandfather's explicit approval of the boundary now being challenged. Lord Ashcombe's counsel argues that survey techniques of that era were imprecise, Alaric continued. Perhaps this is true in some general sense. But precision of measurement was never the foundation of this agreement's legitimacy. Its legitimacy rests entirely on the formal, mutual acceptance of both families involved, an acceptance documented explicitly in writing, signed personally by representatives of each estate, including Lord Ashcombe's own ancestor. If this court now determines that formal agreements between families can be unilaterally revisited generations later simply because one party finds the original terms inconvenient, I would respectfully suggest that no boundary anywhere in this county, nor any inheritance settled through similar historical agreement, remains truly secure. A murmur moved through the courtroom, and Alina, watching from her seat near the front, saw several members of the presiding panel exchange glances that suggested Alaric's words had struck precisely the intended chord. It was not merely a defense of his own land, but a broader argument regarding the sanctity of formal agreements generally, an argument that resonated deeply with a court composed largely of landowners who understood exactly what precedent such a ruling might establish. The formal presentation of documentary evidence followed, methodically walking the court through each piece Alina had uncovered during her exhaustive archive search, culminating in the direct correspondence bearing Ashcombe's great-grandfather's own signature and explicit approval. Lord Ashcombe's confident composure, so evident at the proceedings' outset, had visibly deteriorated by the time the evidence was fully presented. His earlier certainty replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his own family's historical records had been used to dismantle his claim entirely. The presiding magistrate's ruling, delivered after a brief deliberation, came swiftly and decisively in Alaric's favor, dismissing Ashcombe's claim entirely and formally reaffirming the northern boundary exactly as it had stood for generations. Beyond the immediate legal victory, the magistrate added a pointed observation regarding the frivolous nature of challenges brought against long-established agreements without substantial new evidence, a remark clearly directed at discouraging similar opportunistic claims in the future. As the courtroom slowly emptied following the ruling, Ashcombe approached Alaric briefly, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to grudging, uncomfortable respect. "You defended that claim more thoroughly than I anticipated, Voss. I confess, I believed your circumstances would leave you unable to mount an adequate defense." "You believed my blindness left me defenseless, Ashcombe," Alaric replied, his tone measured but carrying an edge Alina had not heard from him before. "You were mistaken. I would advise against making that particular assumption again." Ashcombe offered no further response, departing the courthouse with considerably less swagger than he had arrived with, while Alina, standing beside Alaric as the crowd dispersed around them, felt something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest, a feeling she recognized, with some reluctance, as pride entirely separate from the professional satisfaction of a case well argued. "You spoke beautifully in there," she said quietly as they made their way toward the waiting carriage. "I have never seen a courtroom respond so decisively to a single address." "I had considerable help preparing that address, Miss Marchetti. Every fact I recited, every document referenced, existed only because you found it first, buried in archives most would never have thought to search so thoroughly." "Perhaps," Alina said, "but finding the evidence and delivering it with such conviction before an entire courtroom are two very different accomplishments, Your Grace. I could have handed you every document in that archive, and it would have meant nothing without the composure and clarity you brought to presenting it. That achievement belongs entirely to you." They rode back toward the estate in comfortable silence, the autumn countryside rolling past beyond the carriage windows, and for the first time since his accident, Alaric felt something he had nearly forgotten was possible, a genuine sense of vindication, not merely against Ashcombe's opportunistic claim, but against the years of quiet whispers suggesting he had become incapable of defending what belonged to him. Beside him sat the woman who had made that vindication possible, and though neither yet spoke openly of what had begun growing between them throughout these months of shared purpose and mutual respect, both sensed, with quiet certainty, that something significant had shifted permanently between them. News of the courtroom victory spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried first by those who had witnessed the proceedings firsthand, then repeated and embellished in drawing rooms and marketplaces alike, until the story took on a shape considerably larger than the original events themselves. Within a fortnight, it seemed nearly everyone in the surrounding villages had heard some version of how the blind Duke had stood before the county court, and recited boundary coordinates and decades-old correspondence from memory, defeating a neighboring lord's opportunistic claim through sheer preparation and unwavering resolve. What struck Alina most, as she accompanied Alaric on his now more frequent visits to town for estate business, was how dramatically public perception had shifted in such a short span. Where once conversations had hushed uncomfortably at his approach, replaced by careful, pitying glances exchanged among onlookers, now merchants greeted him with genuine warmth, tenants spoke of him with evident pride, and even those who had previously dismissed him as unfit to manage his own affairs now referenced the Corwin case, and the Ashcombe ruling as evidence of a duke more capable than most who possessed full use of their sight. "They speak of you differently now," Alina observed one afternoon as they walked together through the market square, Alaric's hand resting lightly on her offered arm, a practical accommodation that had become natural between them over these past months. "I hear it in every conversation we pass." I notice it as well, though I confess I remain somewhat suspicious of opinions that shift so readily based on recent events. The same people who once considered me a burden not worth marrying now seem eager to reconsider that assessment entirely. Does that trouble you? Alaric considered the question seriously before answering. It troubles me less than it once might have, though I find myself grateful the shift occurred through genuine demonstration of capability rather than simple pity finally exhausting itself. There is a difference between being accepted because people have grown tired of dismissing you, and being respected because you have proven something true about your character. They continued walking, and Alina noticed several young women glancing toward Alaric with an interest considerably warmer than the careful avoidance he had described experiencing in years past. She felt an unexpected tightness in her chest at the observation, one she recognized, with some discomfort, as something uncomfortably close to jealousy, though she had no rightful claim to such a feeling given the strictly professional nature of her position within his household. "It seems," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, "that the mothers who once steered their daughters away from you may soon reconsider that particular strategy as well." "Perhaps," Alaric replied, though something in his tone suggested the observation held less appeal for him than she might have expected. "Though I find I have grown considerably less interested in such considerations than I once was, before circumstances taught me to value substance over the easy approval of those who required significant demonstration before extending it." Alina said nothing further, though his words lingered with her throughout the remainder of their walk, carrying an implication she was hesitant to examine too closely, uncertain whether she was reading meaning into his statement that he had never intended. That evening, as autumn gave way gradually toward the colder edges of the season, word arrived that Lady Constance, Alaric's aunt and the closest remaining family, he possessed beyond distant cousins scattered across the country, intended to visit the estate for an extended stay. Having heard news of the recent proceedings and expressing considerable interest in meeting the young woman responsible for uncovering both Corwin's theft and the evidence that had secured victory against Ashcombe's claim. Lady Constance arrived 3 days later, a formidable woman in her 60s whose sharp eyes missed little and whose opinions, once formed, rarely wavered thereafter. She greeted Alaric warmly, embracing her nephew with genuine affection before turning her attention immediately toward Alina, studying her with an intensity that made even Alina's usual composure waver slightly. "So you are the young woman who has managed, in the span of a few short months, to accomplish what an entire county of eligible suitors failed to achieve in 3 years," Lady Constance said, her tone carrying equal parts curiosity and evaluation. "I am not certain what you mean, my lady," Alina replied carefully. "I mean that you have restored my nephew's standing in this county, uncovered a betrayal that had gone undetected for years, and secured a courtroom victory that has become the talk of every drawing room from here to the county seat. Most remarkably, you appear to have accomplished all this while treating him as a capable man rather than an object of pity, which I understand is a rather novel approach among those who have interacted with him since his accident." "I simply did the work I was hired to do, my lady, nothing more." Lady Constance's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, a knowing expression crossing her weathered features. "I have lived considerably longer than you, my dear, and I have learned to recognize when someone speaks less than the entire truth, even when the words themselves are technically accurate. But I will not press the matter further this evening. I am simply pleased to finally meet the woman my nephew has mentioned in nearly every letter he has sent me these past months, a frequency, I found, rather telling given how rarely he corresponded with me in the years immediately following his accident." Alina felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her best efforts at maintaining composure, uncertain how to respond to the implications so directly laid before her. She glanced toward Alaric, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, his expression carefully neutral though a faint color had appeared along his cheekbones as well. "Aunt Constance," he said finally, "Miss Marchetti's professional contributions to this estate speak entirely for themselves." I would ask that you not read additional meaning into ordinary correspondence between family members. Of course, Alaric, Lady Constance replied, though her tone carried a knowing amusement that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. I shall simply observe quietly, as is my custom, and draw my own conclusions accordingly. Over the following days, as Lady Constance settled into her extended visit, Alina found herself increasingly aware of small moments between herself and Alaric that she had previously attributed simply to professional familiarity. Moments that now, under Lady Constance's watchful and knowing gaze, seemed to carry considerably more weight than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. The way Alaric's expression softened whenever she entered a room, recognizable to him through footsteps, and the particular rhythm of her movement long before she spoke a single word. The way he sought her opinion on matters entirely unrelated to estate finances, matters of judgment and perspective that had nothing to do with her original professional purpose within his household. The way conversations between them had grown longer, more personal, extending well beyond the practical necessities that had first brought them together. One evening, as Lady Constance retired early citing fatigue from the day's activities, Alina and Alaric found themselves alone in the study, the fire casting warm light across the familiar room that had witnessed so much of their shared history over these past months. "Your aunt is quite perceptive," Alina said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "She is considerably more perceptive than I might sometimes prefer," Alaric replied, a faint smile touching his features. "Though I confess she is not entirely mistaken in whatever conclusions she has drawn." Alina's breath caught slightly at his words, uncertain how directly to interpret them, though something in his tone suggested he had chosen them deliberately, testing the waters of a conversation neither had yet openly acknowledged despite months of growing closeness between them. "Your Grace, I should remind you that I remain employed within your household in a strictly professional capacity. Whatever your aunt has observed, whatever conclusions she has drawn, I would not wish for either of us to act inappropriately given the nature of our current arrangement." "Alina," Alaric said, using her given name for the first time since her arrival, a small but significant shift that did not escape her notice. "I have spent 3 years believing myself permanently unsuited for the kind of connection most people take for granted, convinced that my blindness had rendered me undesirable to any woman capable of choosing otherwise. You arrived in my household expecting nothing beyond a professional arrangement, and yet you have treated me, from our very first conversation, with a directness and respect I had nearly forgotten was possible. I do not know precisely how to name what has grown between us these past months, but I no longer believe it can be adequately described simply as professional familiarity." Alina remained quiet for a long moment, her heart beating considerably faster than the circumstances of an ordinary conversation would typically warrant. "Your Grace, I did not come here seeking anything beyond honest work and fair payment. I would not wish you to believe that my actions these past months were undertaken with any expectation of this. I know that, Alina. That is precisely what makes them meaningful to me. You never sought anything beyond the truth, never softened difficult realities to spare my feelings, never treated me as though my blindness diminished my worth or my capability. Everything you have done, from uncovering Corwin's theft to defending against Ashcombe's claim, was undertaken because you believed it right, not because you hoped for anything in return. That does not answer the question of what should happen now, given everything you have just said." Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "I do not wish to presume anything you are not prepared to acknowledge, Alina. I simply wished you to know that whatever conclusions my aunt has drawn regarding the nature of our connection, she is not entirely mistaken. Beyond that, I leave the matter entirely in your hands, to consider as you see fit, without pressure or expectation." Alina left the study that evening with her thoughts considerably more unsettled than she had anticipated when the day began. Lady Constance's knowing observations and Alaric's carefully honest admission both weighing heavily upon a heart she had not fully realized, was already so thoroughly engaged in matters well beyond professional obligation. Sleep proved elusive that night, and Alina found herself wandering the estate's quiet corridors long after most of the household had retired, her mind turning over Alaric's words again and again, examining them from every possible angle as though sufficient analysis might resolve the uncertainty settled so firmly within her chest. She had come to this estate seeking honest work, nothing more, and had found instead a man whose steady mind and quiet resilience had gradually reshaped her understanding of what genuine partnership between two people might actually look like. She found herself eventually in the small garden behind the estate's western wing, a space Alaric had once described to her as his mother's favorite retreat during her lifetime, now maintained carefully by the household staff despite his inability to appreciate its careful arrangement of flowering shrubs and winding stone pathways through sight alone. The night air carried a sharp autumn chill, and Alina wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she walked slowly along the familiar path, her thoughts still unresolved. "I suspected I might find you here," Alaric's voice said quietly from behind her, and she turned to find him standing near the garden's entrance, having apparently followed the sound of her footsteps through the quiet house. "You could not have known I would come this particular direction, Your Grace. I know the sound of your walk when your thoughts are troubled, Alina. It carries a different rhythm than your ordinary stride, quicker, less certain of its destination. I have learned to recognize a great many things about you these past months, sounds and silences most people never think to notice." Alina felt something warm settle within her chest at his words, the simple acknowledgement that he had studied her presence so carefully, learned the particular language of her movements and moods through attention few sighted people ever bothered to offer one another. "You continue surprising me, Your Grace. I did not realize I had become so thoroughly transparent." "Not transparent," Alaric corrected gently, moving closer along the path with the careful, measured steps of someone long accustomed to navigating familiar spaces without sight. "Simply someone I have learned to listen to more closely than I have listened to anyone in a very long time. I confess, before my accident, I do not believe I ever truly listened to anyone this carefully. I was too occupied with what I could see to bother developing the skill. And now I have little choice but to listen, and I have discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that it reveals considerably more about a person than sight ever managed to show me. I could see a beautiful face across a crowded ballroom for years, Alina, and learn almost nothing true about the person behind it. But I have listened to you speak with tenants who trusted no one, defend evidence before a skeptical court, and challenge my own assumptions without hesitation. And through all of that listening, I have come to know you more thoroughly than I believe I ever truly knew anyone before my accident, sight included." Alina's breath caught at the sincerity carried within his words, entirely without the practiced charm she imagined he might once have wielded so effortlessly before losing his sight, replaced instead by something far more valuable, an honesty stripped of pretense or performance. "I must confess something to you as well, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "When I first arrived at this estate, I expected to find exactly what the county rumors suggested, a bitter man made helpless by misfortune, someone requiring careful management and gentle handling. I did not expect to find someone who questioned his own ledgers, who insisted on personally understanding every detail of his court defense rather than relying entirely on others, who treated my honesty as a gift rather than an inconvenience to be tolerated. And what did you find instead? I found a man whose blindness had taken his sight, but never his mind, never his determination, never his capacity for genuine kindness toward those who earned his trust honestly. I found someone I came to respect far more deeply than I ever anticipated when I first accepted this position, and somewhere along the way, Your Grace, that respect grew into something considerably more difficult to name, exactly as you described earlier this evening." Alaric reached out slowly, his hand finding hers in the darkness with the careful precision of someone long practiced at navigating by touch rather than sight, his fingers closing gently around hers. "Alina, I do not offer you a title, or wealth, or the easy comforts that might once have made courtship between us straightforward for any other woman in this county. I offer you only myself, exactly as I am, a man who cannot see your face but who has come to know your heart more thoroughly than I believe I could have known it through sight alone. If that is enough, if you believe you could build a genuine partnership with a man whose circumstances differ so considerably from what convention typically expects, then I would consider myself the most fortunate man in this county, blindness and all." Alina felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though whether from joy or the sheer weight of emotion carried within his simple, honest declaration, she could not entirely distinguish. "Your Grace, I did not come here seeking a title or wealth either. I came seeking honest work, and I found instead a man who never once asked me to soften the truth, who trusted my judgment without requiring constant reassurance, who treated my presence as valuable rather than merely tolerable. I would be honored to build whatever partnership you envision, provided it remains grounded in the same honesty that has defined every moment between us since my arrival." "Then you accept my meaning, spoken so plainly this evening?" "I accept it entirely, Your Grace. Though I would ask that you call me Alina when we are alone together, given the nature of what you have just proposed between us." "Alina," he repeated, testing the familiarity of her given name spoken with new significance. "Then you must call me Alaric in return, without the formality that has governed our conversations these past months." "Alaric," she said softly, the name carrying an intimacy that settled comfortably between them despite its novelty. They remained together in the quiet garden for a considerable while longer, speaking softly of matters far removed from ledgers and court proceedings, matters of childhood memories, private hopes, and the particular loneliness each had carried silently before circumstances brought them together within these estate walls. Alaric spoke, for the first time since his accident, of the specific fears he had carried regarding his blindness, the quiet terror that no woman would ever look past his condition sufficiently to see the man remaining beneath it. Alina spoke, in turn, of her own reluctance to trust affection offered by those of considerably higher standing, having witnessed enough of her father's merchant clients pursuing convenient arrangements, rather than genuine connection, to grow wary of similar circumstances within her own life. "I do not offer you convenience, Alina," Alaric said, as their conversation drew toward its natural close, the night growing considerably colder around them. "I offer you difficulty, uncertainty, and a life that will require patience neither of us can fully anticipate from this vantage point. But I believe, with genuine conviction, that whatever difficulties arise, we would face them honestly together, exactly as we have faced everything since your arrival at this estate. That is precisely the offer I would choose, Alaric, over any convenient arrangement this county's more eligible bachelors might have provided. I have never valued ease over honesty, and I do not intend to begin now, particularly when honesty has led me somewhere considerably more meaningful than convenience ever could." When they finally returned indoors, the household long since settled into quiet sleep around them. Neither felt any need to rush toward formal announcements or public declarations. What had grown between them these past months, and crystallized fully within the quiet garden that evening, felt too significant, too carefully built upon genuine understanding, to require immediate validation from anyone beyond themselves. That validation, they both understood, would come in time, once the county witnessed for itself exactly what kind of partnership had formed between a duke, long dismissed as unsuitable for marriage, and a woman who had never once seen his blindness as anything resembling a limitation worth dismissing him over. Lady Constance, encountering them both at breakfast the following morning, with an expression carrying considerably more warmth than her usual sharp evaluation, seemed to require no formal announcement to recognize precisely what had transpired between her nephew and the remarkable young woman who had transformed his circumstances so thoroughly these past months. "I believe," she said, smiling knowingly over her morning tea, "that I shall need to begin planning considerably more than an extended visit, if the expressions on both your faces this morning tell me anything reliable about matters likely to unfold in the coming weeks." Neither Alaric nor Alina offered denial, and Lady Constance's satisfied smile widened further still, already turning her considerable energy toward preparations for whatever announcement might soon follow, confident that the county's long-held assumptions about the blind Duke's prospects were about to be thoroughly and permanently overturned. News of the engagement spread through the county even faster than the Corwin scandal or the Ashcombe ruling had before it, though this time the whispers carried an entirely different tone, curiosity mixed with genuine astonishment, rather than the pitying sympathy that had once characterized nearly every conversation regarding the Duke's circumstances. Within days, invitations began arriving at the estate from families who had never before extended social courtesy toward Alaric, each one carefully worded to express delight at the news, while conveniently overlooking the years of careful avoidance that had preceded it. Alina found the sudden shift in social attention somewhat bewildering, though Alaric, having endured considerably more of the county's fickle opinions over the years, greeted the development with wry amusement rather than genuine surprise. "They will come now, offering congratulations, pretending they always believed I would find happiness eventually," he said one afternoon as another stack of invitations arrived, delivered by a messenger who had, months earlier, been among those who avoided direct conversation with him whenever possible. "It matters little to me now, Alina. Their approval was never what I sought, and their belated warmth changes nothing about what you and I have built together these past months. Does it not trouble you, the hypocrisy of it? It troubled me considerably in the years immediately following my accident. But I find I have grown considerably less interested in dwelling on such matters, particularly now that I have something far more valuable than social approval to occupy my attention." Their wedding preparations proceeded through the following weeks with a practical efficiency that mirrored the very nature of their relationship, neither particularly interested in the elaborate spectacle that county tradition typically demanded for a ducal marriage, both preferring instead a smaller, more meaningful ceremony that reflected the genuine partnership they had built rather than performing for an audience whose approval had come so belatedly and so conveniently. Alina's father, Antonio Marchetti, traveled from town to meet the man his daughter intended to marry, arriving with the same practical directness that had clearly shaped his daughter's character so thoroughly. He spent considerable time speaking privately with Alaric before offering his blessing, questioning him not about titles or wealth, matters that held little interest for a merchant who had built his own modest fortune through honest labor, but about character, about how Alaric intended to treat his daughter, about whether the respect Alina described so warmly in her letters home reflected genuine partnership, or merely the temporary gratitude of a man recently rescued from difficult circumstances. "Your daughter has taught me more about honesty and genuine partnership these past months than I learned in my previous 28 years combined, Master Marchetti," Alaric told him during one such conversation. "I do not intend to marry her out of gratitude for services rendered, but because I have come to value her judgment, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to truth more than I value nearly anything else in this world. I would consider it the privilege of my remaining years to build a life alongside someone who has never once treated my blindness as a limitation worth pitying." Satisfied by the sincerity carried within Alaric's words, Antonio offered his blessing readily, and preparations for the wedding proceeded with renewed momentum, Lady Constance overseeing many of the practical arrangements with the same sharp efficiency she brought to every endeavor she undertook. The ceremony itself took place on a clear winter morning, the estate's small chapel decorated simply but elegantly with evergreen boughs and winter roses, attended only by close family and the handful of friends and household staff who had witnessed the genuine transformation of both Alaric's circumstances and his character over these eventful months. Godfrey stood among the witnesses, his expression carrying obvious pride as he watched the Duke he had served through the darkest years, following his accident, finally find genuine happiness. Agnes and several other tenant families from the eastern fields attended as well, having specifically requested the honor after everything Alina's diligent investigation had accomplished on their behalf. Alaric stood at the front of the small chapel, his composure steady despite the significance of the moment, listening carefully as Alina's footsteps approached along the aisle, her particular rhythm unmistakable to him even amid the quiet rustling of the small gathered assembly. When she finally stood beside him, he reached for her hand with the same careful precision that had characterized every gesture between them since their very first meeting, and though he could not see the simple elegance of her gown or the warmth of her expression, he felt everything that mattered most in the steady, familiar pressure of her fingers closing around his own. "I, Alaric Voss, take you, Alina Marchetti, as my wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. "Not because circumstances compelled this arrangement, nor because convenience demanded it, but because you have shown me, through every difficult month since your arrival, exactly what genuine partnership looks like. You have never once allowed my blindness to diminish your respect for my judgment, nor allowed pity to soften the honesty I have come to value above all else. I promise to honor that same honesty throughout whatever years remain to us, to listen as carefully to your voice as I have learned to these past months, and to build alongside you a life grounded in truth rather than convenient pretense." Alina's voice, when she spoke her own vows in return, carried the same steady conviction that had first caught Alaric's attention months earlier, unwavering despite the emotion evident beneath its careful composure. "I, Alina Marchetti, take you, Alaric Voss, as my husband not for your title, nor for the security your position might provide, but because you have proven yourself through every difficult circumstance we have faced together, a man of genuine character, patience, and courage. You never once asked me to soften uncomfortable truths, never treated my judgment as inferior simply because convention might have suggested it should be. I promise to remain honest with you throughout our years together, to challenge you when necessary and support you always, and to build alongside you a partnership that neither pity nor circumstance could ever have created." As the small assembly offered warm applause following the completion of their vows, Alina felt the full weight of everything that had led them to this moment. The initial tension of their first meeting, the careful investigation that uncovered Corwin's betrayal, the tense courtroom victory against Ashcombe's opportunistic claim, and finally, the quiet garden conversation that had transformed professional respect into something considerably deeper and more permanent. None of it had unfolded the way county tradition typically expected for a ducal courtship, and precisely because of that difference, what they had built together felt considerably more genuine than anything convention alone might have produced. The wedding feast that followed carried none of the stiff formality typical of such noble occasions, instead filled with genuine warmth and laughter as tenant families mingled comfortably, alongside household staff and the handful of nobility who had come to witness the ceremony, drawn as much by genuine curiosity as by belated social obligation. Lady Constance, presiding over the gathering with evident satisfaction, made a point of personally thanking Alina for the transformation she had brought not only to Alaric's circumstances, but to the entire estate's fortunes and reputation throughout the county. "You have accomplished something remarkable, my dear," Lady Constance told her privately during a quiet moment amid the celebration. "Not simply marrying my nephew, though that alone would have been remarkable enough given how thoroughly this county once dismissed his prospects. You have restored him entirely, reminded him of exactly who he was before his accident convinced him that man had been permanently lost. That is a gift few could have offered, regardless of how many suitors this county might once have paraded before him." "He restored something in me as well, my lady," Alina replied honestly. "I arrived here believing I sought only honest employment, and I found instead someone who valued my judgment more thoroughly than anyone I had previously encountered, someone who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I already was." In the months that followed their marriage, the estate flourished under their combined stewardship, Alina's careful attention to detail complementing Alaric's renewed confidence in managing affairs. He had once believed permanently beyond his reach following his accident. The eastern fields, now overseen by a rotation of trusted tenant elders following Corwin's departure, produced their most successful harvest in years, the proceeds distributed fairly among the families who had once suffered quietly under years of undetected theft. The northern boundary, secured permanently through the courtroom victory against Ashcombe, remained unchallenged, a settled matter that no longer troubled either of their thoughts. More significantly, the county's perception of Alaric had transformed permanently, no longer defined by the misfortune of his blindness, but by the genuine capability and integrity he had demonstrated so thoroughly throughout the eventful months surrounding his marriage. Young men managing their own estates began seeking his counsel on matters of finance and land disputes, recognizing in him a shrewd, capable mind entirely unaffected by his lack of sight. Mothers who had once steered their daughters carefully away from his company now spoke of him, somewhat sheepishly, as an example of character and resilience worth admiring rather than pitying. For Alaric and Alina themselves, the county's shifting opinions mattered considerably less than the quiet, genuine partnership they had built together, one grounded not in convenient circumstance or belated social approval, but in the same unwavering honesty that had characterized every moment of their relationship since her very first day within his household. What began as a professional arrangement to untangle disordered ledgers had grown, through shared adversity and mutual respect, into a partnership that would come to define the remainder of both their lives, proving conclusively that the true measure of a man had never rested in his ability to see the world around him, but in his character, his resilience, and his willingness to trust honestly in those who proved themselves worthy of that trust in return. 2 years after their wedding, the estate that had once been whispered about as cursed had become instead a place of genuine prosperity, its fields well managed, its tenants fairly treated, and its household staff loyal to a duke and duchess who had earned that loyalty through consistent honesty rather than mere obligation of title. Alina continued her careful oversight of the estate's finances, though her role had grown considerably beyond the bookkeeping duties that first brought her into Alaric's household, now serving as his closest advisor in nearly every matter of consequence affecting their combined lands and responsibilities. Their partnership had, in the years since their marriage, become something of a quiet legend throughout the county, referenced whenever conversation turned toward matters of character and resilience overcoming circumstance. Young women who had once been carefully steered away from any association with the blind duke now spoke openly of admiring the genuine partnership he had built with Alina, recognizing in their marriage something considerably more valuable than the convenient arrangements that typically characterized noble unions throughout the region. Godfrey, now considerably older but still faithfully serving the household he had watched transform so completely, often remarked to newer staff members about the remarkable journey that had led to this current prosperity, careful always to emphasize that the true turning point had never been the courtroom victory against Ashcombe, nor even the exposure of Corwin's lengthy betrayal, but rather the simple, steady honesty Alina had brought into a household that had grown accustomed to careful pity and quiet avoidance in the years following the Duke's accident. She never once treated him as broken, Godfrey would tell those curious about the estate's remarkable transformation. That, more than anything else, changed everything that followed. Lord Ashcombe, in the years since his failed claim against the northern boundary, had grown considerably more cautious in his dealings with neighboring estates, having learned firsthand the folly of underestimating a man simply because circumstance had taken his sight rather than his mind or his resolve. Their relationship remained formal but respectful, neither party inclined toward further conflict given the decisive nature of the earlier ruling. Master Corwin, having served his sentence and made partial restitution toward the sum he had diverted over those 5 years of careful deception, eventually relocated to a distant county, his reputation too thoroughly damaged within the region to rebuild the trust he had once enjoyed for over 2 decades of faithful service before greed and opportunity overcame whatever loyalty had originally motivated his position within the household. For Alaric himself, the years following his marriage brought a peace he had genuinely believed impossible in those difficult months immediately after his accident, when isolation and quiet despair had threatened to define the remainder of his years. He had learned, through Alina's steady presence and unwavering honesty, that his blindness, while permanent and undeniably challenging, had never actually diminished the essential character that made him capable of managing his estate, defending his interests, and ultimately building a partnership grounded in genuine mutual respect rather than convenient pity. I spent 3 years believing myself permanently unsuited for the kind of connection most people take entirely for granted, he reflected one evening, seated with Alina near the same study window where their partnership had first begun so many months earlier. I convinced myself that no woman would ever look past what I had lost to see what genuinely remained. I am endlessly grateful you proved that assumption so thoroughly wrong. You were never as diminished as those years convinced you to believe, Alaric, Alina replied, her hand finding his with the same familiar comfort that had characterized their connection since that first quiet conversation in the garden. You simply needed someone willing to look past the surface long enough to recognize what had always remained true beneath it. Their story, in time, became something occasionally recounted among the county's families, not merely as an unusual tale of romance overcoming unlikely circumstance, but as a genuine lesson regarding the danger of judging a person's worth by their limitations rather than their character. For years, no woman had been willing to wed the blind Duke, deterred by careful whispers and convenient assumptions regarding what his condition might mean for their future prospects. What ultimately changed everything was never a miraculous restoration of his sight, nor any dramatic transformation of his circumstances through wealth or influence, but simply one woman's refusal to see him as anything less than fully capable, fully worthy, and fully deserving of genuine partnership, built on nothing more complicated than honest respect, patient understanding, and the unwavering courage to speak truth, even when convenient silence might have proven considerably easier. In the end, that simple refusal, sustained through months of careful investigation, courtroom defense, and quiet personal connection, had accomplished what 3 years of careful avoidance and pitying whispers never could. It had reminded an entire county, and perhaps most importantly, reminded Alaric himself, that a man's true worth had never rested in what his eyes could perceive, but in the steady character of his heart, the sharpness of his mind, and the genuine courage required to build something lasting alongside someone willing to see him clearly, exactly as he truly was.